You'd think the person who watched you grow up, the one who held your hand when you buried your mom, would be the last person to kick you when you're already drowning. But that's exactly what my sister did. She came into my apartment like a queen, announced a rent hike so brutal it could have put me and my son on the street, and said it like she was doing me a favor. She didn't know my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And when I struck back, she never saw it coming. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you love stories about justice, power, and family drama with a twist. Now let me take you into the moment everything in my life turned upside down. Miranda was always the winner in our family. The one with straight A's, the scholarships, the power suits. She was 13 years older than me, and by the time I was in middle school, she was already flipping condos and flipping people off in courtrooms. Our mom called her fearless. I called her something else. When mom died suddenly, I was barely 18. No money, no guidance, just grief and my sister, who stepped in like a savior and treated me like a burden. She refused to co-sign my student loans, said I needed to learn independence, then turned around and sold the house mom left us without telling me. I found out when the new owners showed up at the door. That was Miranda. Everything with her was business, even blood. I had no choice but to grind. I picked up freelance graphic design gigs while caring for my son Elijah, who's had health issues since he was a baby. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. We were living in a rent-controlled 2-bedroom apartment in an old but stable building on the west side of the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Elijah had painted a little rainbow over his bed, and I'd strung up fairy lights in the kitchen that made everything feel just a little warmer. Then one day, out of nowhere, Miranda showed up at my door. She didn't knock. She just walked in like she owned the place, which, as it turned out, she thought she did. "Elijah's not here?" she asked, looking around. "He's in the ICU. Again," I said, my voice tight. She nodded, as if she'd expected that. Her expression didn't change. "Well, since you've got a moment, let's talk lease. Rent's going up." "To what?" I asked, still in shock she was standing there. $6,900 a month, starting next week, or you're out by sunrise." I couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. My hands started shaking, not because of fear, but because of the quiet rage pulsing in my chest. "You can't do that," I said calmly. "There's a lease, a limit." "Was," she said, smirking. "New ownership, new rules. I manage this building now, and I'm sick of watching you coast through life playing the victim card." "Elijah almost died 2 nights ago," I whispered. "Tragic," she said with a shrug. "But life goes on. Maybe it's time you finally stood on your own 2 feet." I could feel the air leave the room. She thought she had me cornered, but what she didn't know was I'd been watching her moves from a distance, and she just gave me all the ammunition I needed. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply turned away. That night, I lay awake on the stiff hospital recliner next to Elijah's bed, holding his small hand in mine, my mind racing. I knew what I had to do, and I knew it had to be quiet. Because if there's one thing Miranda never learned, it's that silence can be louder than screams. 2 years before Miranda stood in my living room and tried to price me out of my own home, I was working for a nonprofit legal aid office downtown. It wasn't glamorous. Most days were spent buried in paperwork, translating legalese into plain English for tenants on the verge of eviction. But I loved it. I believed in what we were doing. We helped seniors fight unlawful rent hikes, immigrants understand their rights, and single parents, people like me, hold on to the only housing they could afford in a city that was trying to swallow them whole. That job didn't pay much, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. One client in particular stood out. His name was Edward Ned Hutchinson. He was in his late 70s, lived alone, and had owned multiple buildings across the city since the 1970s. He dressed like he hadn't bought clothes since then, too. Faded flannel, coffee-stained khakis, and a hat with a feather in it that he claimed once belonged to Neil Young. He came to us for help fighting a developer that wanted to bully him into selling the last building he still held, a small aging property with 6 units in Westchester. My building. I didn't know that at the time. I just knew he was kind, if gruff, and that he liked to bring in egg salad sandwiches and unsolicited advice about plumbing. We bonded slowly over long afternoons sorting through contracts and zoning permits. He reminded me of my dad, before the cancer. Quiet, blunt, but decent. One day, I mentioned in passing that I lived in a rent-controlled unit with my son, and he asked me which street. When I told him, he grunted and changed the subject. I didn't think much of it. A month later, he called me back into the office on a Saturday. No paperwork, just a long conversation. He told me he was dying, pancreatic cancer. Maybe 6 months left, tops. I've got a will, he said, but I don't want to die knowing some bloodless trust fund kid's gonna strip that building for parts. He looked at me hard. You got fight in you, Lauren. I was stunned. What? I've been watching how you work. You give a damn. Not many people do. You understand what housing means to people like you and me. He paused. I want to sell you the building. Not for profit, just enough to make it legal. I blinked. Ned, I can't afford. You don't need to. I've already got a trust lawyer on it. It'll be through an LLC. Quiet, clean. I'll hold it for 6 months. Then it's yours. Only thing I ask is that you protect the tenants. I remember sitting there, my hands shaking, thinking it was a joke, but he wasn't smiling. Developers like your sister, he muttered. Make me sick. I hadn't even told him about Miranda, but somehow he knew. 6 months later, he passed away quietly in his sleep. I attended the funeral. No family came, just me and 2 other tenants. I wore all black and cried more than I expected. The LLC came into my name shortly after. Hutchinson Properties, restructured under my full legal name and my lawyer's oversight. We kept it hidden for protection and strategic leverage. The tenants didn't know. Neither did the building's previous manager. Miranda didn't come into the picture until months after his passing. She'd somehow convinced the estate attorney that she had experience in property management and wanted to stabilize the building during the transition period. They assigned her as temporary manager, never realizing the ownership had already shifted quietly to me. She assumed the LLC was just some out-of-town investor. I let her believe it. And I watched. I watched as she jacked up rents illegally, tried to force tenants to sign new leases under threat of eviction, and refused to fix basic issues like leaking ceilings and broken heaters. She sent out notices with corporate letterhead, but I traced them. None of it went through legal channels. She was bluffing. Always bluffing. One tenant, Mrs. Rivera, a 70-year-old widow who'd lived there longer than me, had a leak in her ceiling so bad it collapsed in the winter. Miranda told her it was user damage and charged her for the repair. I reimbursed Mrs. Rivera anonymously. Miranda never suspected. She thought I was too soft, too quiet. She had no idea that every email she sent to tenants, every threat she whispered at their doorsteps, every forged maintenance notice was copied, archived, and handed straight to my attorney. But I didn't act, not yet. I needed her to feel safe, to believe she'd won, until she came for Elijah. That night, after she left my apartment with that cruel smile still fresh on her lips, I didn't sleep. I called my lawyer, Jason Patel. He knew everything. We'd been preparing for this moment for over a year. She crossed the line, I said. It's time. Jason didn't hesitate. Okay, let's finalize the package. We spent 3 days compiling everything. The deed in my name, notarized, a cease and desist against her management activities, formal complaints filed with the housing authority, a tenant testimony packet, and the final black envelope. As we worked, Jason said something I'll never forget. She's been throwing firecrackers, but you're sitting on a fuse. Let her light it, then let her burn. I nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready to stop playing defense, ready to show my son and myself that silence didn't mean weakness, it meant precision. I watched Miranda dig her own trap for months. She was arrogant enough to forget that even in real estate, what's built on bad faith always crumbles. And I had the match ready. The hospital room was quiet that morning, too quiet. Elijah was finally sleeping after a long night of IVs and blood draws and more alarms than I ever wanted to hear again. His little body looked even smaller under the sheets, but his chest rose and fell, steady and calm. That was all I needed. I left just before sunrise, my eyes gritty, my sweatshirt wrinkled from sleeping in a chair. I wanted to take a quick shower, grab clean clothes, and maybe eat something that hadn't come from a vending machine. But when I turned the corner onto our floor, I stopped cold. There it was, taped across my front door. A 24-hour eviction notice. Typed, bold, official-looking letterhead. But I recognized the format immediately, one of the fake templates Miranda had sent to other tenants before. It wasn't real, but it was loud. I stared at it for a long time until my hands stopped shaking. Then I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo, peeled the paper off cleanly, and walked inside. I folded it, crisp and square, and slid it into the black envelope waiting on my kitchen counter, the same one Jason had prepped with the rest of the documents. My hands were calm, steady. I zipped up my hoodie, grabbed my keys, and left. Miranda had made a mistake when she brought Ward to my doorstep. She thought I was still that scared girl scrambling for favors. But I'd stopped asking. Now I was delivering. The rooftop cafe was Miranda's favorite showplace. She used it to close deals and post curated brunch photos with hack boss energy captions. It was sleek, overpriced, and loud. Exactly like her. She was seated under a large umbrella, wearing sunglasses the size of satellites and a blazer that probably cost more than my car. She didn't look surprised when I approached, just amused. Well, she said, sipping her mimosa. Didn't expect you to crawl back this fast. I didn't sit. I just set the black envelope on the table. Just here to deliver something, I said. She leaned back, lips curling. What is this? Your list of excuses? I'm not your therapist, Lauren. I said nothing. Just looked at her, the way you look at someone who's already stepped off a cliff. They just haven't hit the ground yet. She peeled open the envelope lazily, pulling out the first document. At first, she laughed. Then she stopped. I watched her face change, second by second. First confusion, then disbelief, then something colder, recognition. Her fingers gripped the edges of the deed copy. Her lips parted as she scanned the text. Hutchinson Properties, LLC, new ownership transfer, effective date. Full legal beneficiary name, Lauren Renee Maddox. No, she said softly. That's not. This isn't real. I slid the second sheet forward. A notarized legal note from my attorney. Effective immediately, all property management responsibilities assigned to Miranda Elise Maddox are revoked. Her access to Hutchinson Properties buildings is hereby terminated. Trespassing charges applicable if violated. Miranda's face drained of color. You set me up. I gave you space, I said. I gave you silence. You mistook that for submission. You've been sitting on this for how long? She hissed. Long enough to know exactly how you'd react. She slammed the envelope shut, knocking over her drink. Orange juice soaked the edge of the table, but neither of us moved. This isn't over, she said, voice low. It is, I replied. You were never the owner, just a placeholder, and now you're not even that. Miranda stared at me, her whole body frozen, like she couldn't decide whether to scream or run. Her power, so loud, so sharp, had evaporated in one envelope. Because it was never real. You don't know how this works, she said, grasping. You're not a landlord. You're not a businesswoman. You're a charity case with a kid and a part-time job. I leaned down, my voice soft but steady. You're right about one thing. I'm not like you. I don't hurt people to feel important. I don't burn homes to build an empire, but I know exactly what ownership means. She didn't speak. She couldn't. So I turned and walked away, the sun rising behind me as I stepped onto the street. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Jason, confirming the notices had been delivered to city housing. Everything was in motion now. I didn't smile. Not yet. But I finally breathed, and it felt like the first time in years. I walked out of that cafe like I'd just left a battlefield, calm on the outside, but my heart was pounding in my chest, every breath catching like I'd run a marathon. It wasn't fear. Not anymore. It was release. After years of being belittled, dismissed, underestimated, even by my own blood, there was finally space to breathe. Not because Miranda had given it to me, but because I'd taken it back. Quietly, on my terms. When I returned to the building, there were already people waiting. Mrs. Rivera was outside with her laundry cart. Two of the younger tenants, Sasha and Malik, stood by the mailbox, holding rent notices with confused expressions. One of the elderly residents, Mr. Krause, had his door cracked open, peeking out like he'd heard something brewing. They'd all gotten the same threats I had. And they were all still waiting for someone to tell them whether they'd have a place to sleep tonight. I walked into the courtyard and cleared my throat. Hi, I said, voice louder than I meant. I know a lot of you don't really know me, or if you do, it's just from passing in the hallway. My name is Lauren Maddox. I live in 2B, And as of last year, I became the legal owner of this building. There was silence. No one moved. Even the breeze seemed to pause. I didn't say anything because I wanted to get a handle on things quietly. I wasn't planning on managing it myself at first, but after what's happened recently with Miranda, I felt like you all deserve to know who's really in charge. Mrs. Rivera's eyes widened. Malik's mouth dropped open. Sasha blinked like she didn't believe what she just heard. "You own this?" she asked. I nodded. "Through an LLC. It's all legal. I can show you the papers." There was a moment of hesitation, and then the questions poured in. "Are you going to raise rent again? Do we have to move? Can you fix the back staircase? It's been cracked for months. Is she really gone?" I held up my hands gently. "Yes, I'm keeping rent where it is." "No, you're not moving. Yes, the repairs are already on the list. And yes, Miranda's out, effective immediately." Mrs. Rivera started to cry. "I begged her," she whispered, "for 3 years, just to fix my bathroom. The mold started making me sick. She said I was lying." I walked over and took her hand. It was shaking. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "No one should be treated like that. Not in their own home." She wiped her eyes with the edge of her cardigan and nodded. That night, I contacted Jason and had him activate the contract with a new property management company, a small, woman-led firm that specialized in ethical housing practices. Within 48 hours, they had crews on site doing full inspections, starting with emergency repairs. We prioritized Mrs. Rivera's apartment, then the broken laundry machines, the cracked stairs, and the leaking roof. The building was old, but it had good bones, just like its tenants. I visited Elijah the next morning. His color was better, his numbers were improving. He even managed a tiny smile when I brought him a hand-drawn card from Mrs. Rivera that said, "You're strong like your mama." He clutched it to his chest as I sat beside him. "We're not leaving," I told him softly. "This is our home." He blinked up at me, still groggy from medication. "You fixed it?" I nodded. "Mommy fixed it." For the first time in days, I saw his little shoulders relax. And for the first time in years, I believed I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. But of course, Miranda wasn't finished. She showed up 2 days later. I was in the lobby talking with one of the contractors when the glass doors flew open and she stormed in like a woman possessed. "Lauren," she snapped, "we need to talk." I turned, slow and deliberate. "I'm busy." "Don't pull this righteous act with me," she hissed, heels clicking across the tile. "You set me up. You manipulated me." "I let you do exactly what you always do," I said calmly. "Push people until they break." "Can we please talk in private?" she said, eyes flicking toward the maintenance guy behind me. I motioned toward the mailroom. She followed. Inside, the moment the door closed, she let the mask drop. "Look," she said, folding her arms. "Maybe I went too far. I see that now. I got caught up. It wasn't personal." "You threatened to evict me while my son was in the ICU," I said flatly. She rolled her eyes. "It was business, Lauren. This is what real estate is. You either get ahead or you get trampled." I didn't know about his condition. "Yes," I said quietly. "You did." She hesitated, and I could see it, just for a second, the crack in her confidence. "I want to stay on," she said, switching tactics. "As manager, you're not trained for this, and I already know the building. Let's be honest. You're not cut out for long-term ownership. I can help keep it clean, keep it profitable." I stared at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Business doesn't threaten an 8-year-old boy in a hospital bed." Her face twisted. "So that's it?" "That's it. I made one mistake." "You made a dozen," I snapped. "You treated people like garbage. You lied. You stole. You scared seniors into signing illegal leases. And then you tried to destroy me. That's not one mistake, Miranda. That's a pattern." She stared at me, stunned. No comeback. No insult. "You've always seen compassion as weakness," I said, stepping back. "But it's what made me strong enough to outlast you." Then I opened the door. "We're done." She walked out in silence, and this time I didn't watch her go. When the dust settled and Miranda finally disappeared from the building for good, I thought the worst was over. But I quickly learned that removing her was only the beginning. The financial mess she left behind was deeper than I expected. It started when the new property manager reviewed the books. Entire months of rent payments were missing. Tenants who had receipts but weren't marked as paid in the system. Late fees had been tacked on to nearly everyone's account, often for amounts that didn't match any actual rent schedule. Maintenance charges for things that were never repaired. Even a few pest control surcharges billed to units that never had inspections, let alone exterminators. And then there were the receipts. Some of them were so obviously fake, they might as well have been drawn in crayon. One stood out in particular, $3,200 billed to Mrs. Rivera for a full bathroom renovation. When I went to check, I found the same cracked tile and moldy ceiling she'd been begging to have fixed for 3 years. I handed everything to Jason, who immediately began documenting the fraud for a formal complaint to the housing department and the city's attorney general. Miranda had covered her tracks sloppily, but only just enough to make it a headache, not enough to make it untraceable. Meanwhile, I made a decision. Every dollar she wrongfully took, I would give back. It took weeks of meetings and spreadsheets and legal review, but slowly, bit by bit, we started issuing small checks to tenants for their stolen money. Some of them were only for $50. Others, like Mr. Krause's, were well over $1,000. Every time we handed one over, the reactions made it worth it. "I thought no one cared," he said quietly, holding the check with trembling hands. "We do now," I told him. But the worst discovery came when one of the contractors mentioned something odd. An old storage room on the basement floor had been cleared out, emptied completely, and padlocked shut. When I asked around, I found out Miranda had tried to sell the space to an outside buyer as creative studio rental. She'd listed it online, showed it to at least 2 people, and even collected a deposit from one. All under the table. No records. No lease. It was illegal. And it was risky. If that buyer had moved in, I could have been dragged into a lawsuit. Thankfully, the deal fell through before anyone moved anything in. But it was another reminder of just how little Miranda cared about the people or the place. So I fixed it. All of it. The locks were replaced, the books cleaned up. The basement storage was reassigned fairly to long-term residents who actually needed it. We reinstalled the laundry machines Miranda had temporarily removed during some fake waterline repairs. And through it all, something started to shift. People I'd lived next to for years, people I'd barely exchanged more than polite nods with, started showing up at my door. Mrs. Rivera brought empanadas on Thursday mornings. Malik offered to run Elijah's prescriptions from the pharmacy. Sasha, who worked part-time at a preschool, offered to watch Elijah when I had to take meetings. One afternoon, Elijah, finally discharged and home again, was out in the courtyard drawing in chalk when a few of the tenants joined him. I watched from the kitchen window as they helped him make a huge mural, trees, flowers, smiling faces. At the center of it, in big block letters, he'd written, "This is our home." I could have cried. We weren't just tenants anymore. We were a community. And with that came responsibility, not just as a landlord, but as someone with knowledge, with tools, with power I could share. So I started a weekly workshop. Every Saturday morning, I set up folding chairs in the laundry room, passed out handouts I designed myself, and taught Tenant Rights 101. The first week, only 3 people came. By the third week, there were 12. Neighbors, cousins, even a woman from another building nearby who'd heard through word of mouth. We talked about rent control, legal eviction procedures, how to read your lease, how to fight unfair fees. We role-played how to call the housing board. I brought in a guest speaker, my friend Tasha from the nonprofit, who shared her story about going up against a slumlord in court and winning. It was more than just teaching. It was restoring something Miranda had taken from everyone, the belief that they mattered. One night, after the class ended and I was stacking chairs back against the wall, Mrs. Rivera stayed behind. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Your sister thought power came from scaring people." I nodded. "She was wrong," she said. "Real power looks like this." I think about that often. Miranda feared losing control because she believed it was the only thing that gave her value. She didn't realize that control is fleeting, but trust, community, and care? That's the kind of power that roots itself deep and lasts. She tried to build her empire on intimidation and ego. I'm building mine on truth, fairness, and kindness. It takes longer. It's harder. But it holds. It holds the people I care about. It holds the building together. And most importantly, it holds me. The first thing I did after the dust settled was paint the kitchen. Not a big renovation. Not a total overhaul, just a color change. Soft yellow, the exact shade my mother used to have in the kitchen I grew up in. I found the paint swatch buried in an old photo album and matched it at the hardware store. I didn't even hire anyone. I did it myself, tarped the floor, played Motown records, and took my time. It felt symbolic, somehow, like I was reclaiming something I'd lost a long time ago. Not just the building, not just safety, but memory, joy. When I finished, I hung a row of herbs above the sink: basil, rosemary, and thyme. Elijah had once told me he wanted a kitchen that smelled like pizza and flowers. This was our compromise. The morning Elijah came home from the hospital, I picked him up in a borrowed car, bundled him into the back seat with his favorite blanket, and told him to close his eyes as we turned onto our street. "Is it a surprise?" he asked, grinning weakly. "Kind of," I said, "but mostly, it's just home." When we got inside, he hobbled slowly through the apartment, still weak from weeks in a hospital bed. But when he saw the yellow kitchen, he gasped. "You painted it," he said. I nodded. "Looks like Grandma's," he whispered, then hugged my waist. Later that day, while I was folding laundry, I found a drawing he'd left on the table. Crayon on scrap paper. It showed our building with big windows, green plants out front, and stick figure neighbors smiling from balconies. At the bottom, he'd written in crooked letters. I sat down and cried right there at the kitchen table. It wasn't just pride. It was healing. This building had once felt like something temporary, something I was clinging to. But now it felt rooted, real, ours. A week later, we launched the community garden. It started with a few pots by the back fence. Mrs. Rivera brought herbs, Malik contributed some tomato starters, and Sasha somehow convinced the manager to dig out a small plot near the courtyard wall. We spent a Saturday morning planting together, laughing over spilled soil and crooked garden stakes. Someone brought sunflowers. Elijah planted a packet of wildflowers for the bees. I painted little signs that said, "Please don't pick me yet," and "Grown with love, not pesticides." It didn't take long for word to spread. By mid-month, a tenants' rights group in the city reached out and invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. They'd heard about the workshops, the ownership story, the way I'd turned the building around without selling out the people inside. I hesitated at first. Public speaking was never my thing. But then I thought about everything Miranda had taken from people by pretending to be powerful. If I had a chance to show what real strength looked like, I had to take it. I showed up to that meeting with a folder full of notes and left with 3 more workshop invitations and a small standing ovation. That night, after Elijah went to bed, I found a message in my inbox. It was from Miranda. No greeting, no explanation, just 4 words. "You ruined me. Congratulations." I stared at the screen for a full minute, and then I closed the laptop. No reply. No energy wasted. She wanted a reaction. What she got was silence. Instead, I wrote a check. One of the tenants, Nina from 3A, had recently gotten out of the hospital after a fall and was behind on rent. Jason helped me create a one-time hardship grant through the LLC account. No fanfare. No big announcement. Just a folded envelope left at her door with a note. "We're glad you're still with us. Take your time getting back on your feet." That's what community meant now. That's what home meant. On Sunday evening, I hosted a dinner in the courtyard. It wasn't anything fancy: pasta salad, garlic bread, sweet tea in mason jars, but every unit showed up. People brought dishes, folding chairs, mismatched plates. Someone brought a speaker and played old-school R&B. Kids chased each other with bubble wands, while the adults swapped stories about the building's quirks. I looked around at one point and realized this wasn't the same place it had been a year ago. Not even close. It was softer, warmer, real. When the sun dipped behind the neighboring building and the string lights flickered on, I caught Elijah in the corner of my eye, giggling with 2 other kids as they passed around cookies. Mrs. Rivera sat beside me, sipping tea and humming to the music. Malik offered to help fix the busted porch light next week. Sasha said we should do dinner like this every month. I didn't need to speak. I just smiled. Because after everything, after the pain, the fights, the silence, the strategy, I'd done what I set out to do. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living. Together. At home. For most of my life, I let Miranda define me. She was always the one with the sharp voice and sharper shoes, the straight A report cards, the firm handshake, the endless ambition, the one who knew how to twist a moment to her advantage before anyone else even saw it coming. And me? I was the soft one, the helper, the girl who stayed behind after class to clean up paintbrushes, the woman who worked 3 jobs but never managed to impress anyone at Thanksgiving, the sister with the kid and the coupons and the quiet dreams. I didn't grow up thinking I'd ever own anything. I thought survival was a miracle in itself. And maybe that's why Miranda always had power over me. She told me what I was worth so many times that I started to believe it, that I was weak, poor, dependent, a charity case who should be grateful just to have a roof. But that day in the cafe, when I watched her face turn ghost white at the sight of my name on the deed, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. Not mine. Hers. Because in that moment, she realized something she'd spent her whole life trying to ignore, that I'd stopped playing her game, that I'd rewritten the rules, that I hadn't just survived, I'd outlasted her. Her empire had always been built on fear. Mine? Mine was built on roots. Not flashy, not loud, but strong, deep, and mine. Owning that building didn't make me rich. In fact, most months I break even after maintenance, reserves, and upgrades. I still make grocery lists based on what's on sale. I still budget like a single mom who knows the system isn't built for her. But you know what it did give me? Dignity, agency, pride. I used to hate the word owner. It sounded cold, greedy, like someone who sat on a pile of contracts and waited for checks. Someone who only cared about property values and investment returns. But now, I say it without flinching. I'm an owner of a building, of a future, of my voice. I use it differently than Miranda ever did. I don't use it to shut doors. I use it to open them. Elijah's drawings have changed. He used to fill pages with scribbles in dark pencil, houses with no windows, stick figures with slanted eyes, buildings that lean to one side like they might fall. But now, his drawings are full of color. He draws the building with sunflowers out front, rainbow-colored balconies, smiling neighbors waving hello. He adds Mom's house in blocky letters across the top of every page. He shows them to me with pride. One night before bed, he told me, "You're like the boss of the whole building." I smiled and kissed his forehead. "No, baby," I said. "I'm the gardener." He looked confused. "I just make sure everything and everyone has what they need to grow." A few weeks ago, a letter showed up at our mailbox. Not an email, not a text, a real letter, folded in an envelope and addressed in careful cursive. It was from a former tenant, Angela, who'd been forced to move out during Miranda's reign. "I don't even know if you remember me," she wrote, "but I lived in 4A. When Miranda raised my rent to $5,000, I had no choice but to leave. I lost my mom's old apartment, the place where my daughter took her first steps." She paused. I could almost hear the breath she must have taken before writing the next line. "But I heard what you did. I heard you took it back, that you made it safe again. I just wanted to say thank you. It gives me hope to know that someone like you is in charge now. Not just a landlord, but a real one." I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it up and tucked it in the drawer where I keep Elijah's best drawings. Legacy, pressed between paper. These days, I do more than run one building. I've started a program with a few women from my old nonprofit days, teaching housing workshops, helping single moms and low-income renters form LLCs and protect themselves legally. Most people don't even realize how accessible it is to structure ownership through legal tools. They think you need millions or connections or a last name that unlocks doors. But we teach them otherwise. We sit in community centers and church basements with handouts, coffee, and clipboards. We show them how to form trusts, how to write fair leases, how to challenge illegal fees, how to recognize a trap before it closes. Because I learned the hard way, protection shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a right. And knowledge? That's the first key. I don't think about Miranda much anymore. Sometimes her name pops up on some business website. Her LinkedIn quietly scrubbed, a failed project here, a new pitch there. But the glint she used to have, it's dulled. Maybe she still blames me. Maybe she doesn't. But I'll tell you this. She thought owning meant collecting checks. I learned it meant protecting people, and that makes all the difference. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and whether you've ever faced something similar. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories of struggle, resilience, and quiet victories that matter. Thank you for being here, and wherever you are, may you always have a place to call home.